Good morning, church. Good morning, good morning. We're this morning continuing our series on prayer, and I've got to confess that this morning is a bit of a challenge for me. I'll admit that there's a lot of Sunday mornings where I feel a sense of anxiousness just because I know that I'm going to be getting in front of God's people and I'm going to be sharing the Lord's Word, but this morning particularly, as we continue our series on prayer, we're going to be looking at unanswered prayer. And the challenge for me is that I know as we talk about unanswered prayer, that I'm likely stepping into the space of people's biggest pain, vulnerability, and disappointment. That these are the spaces in life in which we navigate and just wonder, where is God? What is he up to? I don't understand. Today we navigate a place of mystery. We navigate a place of frustration and even of anger. And I don't want to tread in that lightly. What I don't want to do is just act like Job's friends, for those of you that are familiar with that story within Scripture, and then just start assaulting you with my opinions and my answers. But what I hope would happen in this space is a place of just recognizing that I see those places of disappointment. And I see those places of doubt, and I see those places of frustration and anger. And if anything, just to be able to sit with you in that and to be a friend in those spaces. The night before Jesus' crucifixion, he prayed for the cup of suffering to be taken away from him. And in that space, Jesus asks his friends, sit with me. Sit with me in this place of great pain. His words are that his soul was being crushed by grief to the point of death. And as he does this, as he invites his friends to sit with him, I think what he does is he demonstrates something that is really important for all of us. While we may not provide the perfect answers for one another in our places, in the points of our greatest points of pain, it's important that we learn to sit with one another. That part of God's grace to us is that he provides people that will sit with us when we're absolutely crushed. Jesus, in this space, and it's absolutely astounding to say this, was asking for humanity's compassion. What he does is he turns to his friends and he says, come sit with me in my place of suffering. It was a request to humanity to give us the honor that God so often has, where he sits with us in our places of weakness and turmoil. And it's a picture that stuns us because it shows us the extent to which God humbles himself. Please, friends, come sit with me. And we can't do it. The disciples fell asleep. The heaviness of Jesus' heart wasn't enough to keep the heaviness of their eyelids open. Stay awake, right? We cry out in this moment to Peter and to John. Be there for your friend. And while they can't stay awake and sit there with Jesus, what's stunning to look at is that even in his greatest point of weakness, Jesus offers the disciples rest. Even in his greatest point of need, Jesus teaches us what it's like to sit with people who need companionship. Go ahead and rest, he tells them. The night he feels the weight of the crucifixion, where he will take on our sin and our death, he sits with us and he watches over us. Beloved, God sits with us. God watches over us. It is what he is compelled to do. He sits with us. The other thing I've been thinking about in this leaning into this morning is that when you look at those that were with Jesus and were firsthand witnesses and even participants in the miraculous work of his hands, also regularly wrote to the church about suffering, pain, and endurance. And you would think, right, that here are these peoples that are walking around all of Israel, right? They're walking around all of Galilee and walking through Jerusalem and seeing all the miraculous works that Jesus is doing, that their letters to the church might sound a little bit different. That all that we would read of in these letters would just be, God's going to do the miraculous in your life. That the brokenness is going to go away, that the pain is going to be done with, that there's not going to be any more death, that there's not going to be any more disease, that right here, right now, in Rome, all the problems are going to be solved. But when you read through their letters to the church, what you actually find is that they teach the church to walk in the ways of perseverance, endurance, and perseverance and faithfulness. They write to the church and say things like this: "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy. Dear friends, don't be surprised at the fiery trials you're going through, as if something strange were happening to you. We can rejoice when we run into problems and trials, for we know that they help us develop endurance. You suffered along with those who were thrown into jail, and when all you owned was taken from you, you accepted it with joy. You knew that there were better things waiting for you that will last forever." The church that knew the words of eternal life often wrote words to one another about dealing with and navigating the trials and hardships of this world. And one of the most insightful points of reflection on this mysterious place that we navigate, of living with the miraculous and the disappointment, is written by the Apostle Paul. I'm going to read it to you. It's in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and starting at verse 1. It says, "This boasting will do no good, but I must go on. I will reluctantly tell you about visions and revelations from the Lord. I was caught up into the third heaven 14 years ago. Whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Yes, only God knows whether I was in my body or outside my body, but I do know that I was caught up to paradise and heard things so astounding that they cannot be expressed in words, things no human is allowed to tell. That experience is worth boasting about, but I'm not going to do it. I will only boast about my weaknesses. If I wanted to boast, I would be no fool in doing so, because I would be telling the truth. But I won't do it, because I don't want anyone to give me credit beyond what they can see in my life or hear in my message. Even though I have received such wonderful revelations from God. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 times I begged the Lord, take it away. Each time he said, my grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Looking at this passage, let's just start here. In this life, Paul experienced both paradise and torment. This is the tension that we exist in. A taste of heaven, an experience of God's kingdom here on earth, overwhelmed by the goodness and majesty of the Father, and the current torment, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities of the world. Paul experienced great insight, and Paul navigated incredible confusion. Paul heard things that he can't even begin to repeat. He peered deep into the mysteries of God. Yet he also had this place of torment that he wasn't freed from. He had angelic visions and demonic opposition. And he teaches us something. That as we navigate this place of confusion and pain and frustration, when we talk about unanswered prayer, we must be reminded that currently, this earth, the current status and ways of this earth, they are our home. And we don't like to admit that, and we want to run away from that, but we're constantly reminded this is the place of our living. This place in its complex blend of brokenness and God's good creation is where we currently live. And sometimes what we run into is that we realize that our prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like them to be answered because we currently live in the governing principles of creation. Pete Greig, by the way, I'll take a little side note and just tell you this, that if you're going to, two books that I would absolutely recommend to you as you wrestle with the idea of unanswered prayer and brokenness and pain and suffering in the world are these two books. One is called God on Mute by Pete Greig, and the other is Prayer in the Night by Tish Harrison Warren. Absolutely just beautiful, pastoral, poetic, insightful reflections on what we navigate this morning. But Pete Greig says this delicate and infinitely complex world is our home. We are called to rule it, but we're also part of it, and therefore subject to its laws. God has intricately established certain governing principles, laws of nature, for example, that make life work, and that they do so most of the time with almost infinite complexity and exquisite harmony. If God did miracles all the time, continually interfering with the governing principles of life on earth in answer to every single one of our prayers, far from creating a cornucopia of greater happiness, the effects, in fact, would be devastating. And so in this place, we have to trust God cares for all of his creation. In this place, we have to say there are things that we cannot comprehend. Paul gets a glimpse into a heavenly scene, and it's like the space of saying, man, I could boast about this, but what it actually leads me to is a place of humility to say, I have to boast in my weaknesses. We don't understand. We can't comprehend it. But God is caring for all of creation. He's done so by creating things like gravity and wind currents. Spring, summer, fall, and winter are all by his good design. And so we have to be a people that embrace wonder and mystery. Paul heard things so astounding that our forms of communication are incapable of describing them. I don't like it, but here's what we're reminded of. We can't grasp the full picture. We may not get the answer to why God is caring for creation the way that he's caring for creation, but the good news is we get relationship with the Creator. He sits with us. I like the way that Mike Cosper comes to a conclusion. He says, our clawing, our grasping attempts at answering every question to make sense of every mystery in life will end up in failure. Instead, God invites us to take a tour of the mad world around us, to see ourselves as one mystery among the many, and to trust him that it all makes sense in some strange cosmic way. In doing so, we discover that the presence of mystery in the world is an invitation to wonder, and a world without mystery is a world of despair. The other thing that we've got to wrestle with in the current state of the world is that sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we desire for them, is because we're experiencing the ongoing impact of human free will. And here we're reminded that our lives are not lived in a vacuum, but they have impact on others. Our lives are woven together. For those of us that are sitting in this room, look around this room. The chairs you're sitting on, the clothes that you're wearing, the stage that I'm standing on, the roof above our head. They exist because of the labor of others. We don't live in a vacuum. We live in a place of human choice, constantly running in to one another, having impact upon each other. Our chairs, our phone, our clothes, our water bottles, right? All of it is this declaration to us, this constant reminder to us that our free will and our choices are having impact upon one another. And so what we do, our labor, our choices, none of it exists in a vacuum. We were designed, this is the other reminder, is that we were designed to partner with God in the ongoing work of creation, to be a source of blessing and joy in this world. But often our free choice is actually decisions for destruction. And so maybe you see them here with me in this moment. Do you see Cain and Abel? God steps before Cain, and he tells him, sin is crouching before you. It's desiring to control you. And in this space, what we would love for God to do is to step in front of Cain and say, I'm not going to let you make that choice. But he doesn't. See, the way of God isn't to control. The way of God isn't just to be a puppet master, and he isn't forceful and violent. He's not going to control us, but his way is to woo us towards himself. His approach is with gentleness and with patience to entice our hearts towards him, to lovingly influence us towards himself. In this space with Cain and Abel, what he just does is to tell him, sin is crouching at your door, and you've got a choice. You have a choice. C.S. Lewis says this: we can perhaps conceive of a world in which God corrected the results of this abuse of free will by his creatures at every moment. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, in which therefore freedom of will would be void. Nay, if the principle were carried to its logical conclusion, even evil thoughts would be impossible, for the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task if we attempted to frame them. That God can and does on occasions modify the behavior of matter and produce what we call miracles is part of the Christian faith. But the very conception of a common and therefore stable world demands that these occasions be extremely rare. Try to exclude the possibility of suffering with the order of nature and the existence of free wills involved, and you find that you have excluded life itself. So God beckons us to choose him, to join him and to partner with him in his work of blessing, of renewal, of reconciliation in this world. Tish Harrison Warren, our work was always meant to be a source of blessedness, abundance, and joy that ripples through all eternity. As we weep over the brokenness and futility of work and watch for God to restore all things, we also work with whatever limited gifts, influences, and capacity God has given us for the renewal of work itself and of systems of labor and commerce in our world. Sometimes, what Paul gives us insight here to is that sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we like because there's also demonic opposition in the world. Paul also shows us that there are times that punk Satan, the accuser, is at play in the world. It's not just created order with its governing principles, and it's not just our free will that are part of the equation. There is a ruler of this current dark age, Satan, that seeks to impose his will upon the world. And often I think that what ends up happening is that we realize that we have these different points of pain, of vulnerability that we're navigating in our lives. And the accuser comes along and he seeks to provoke and to poke at those places in which God is working in our lives. Like he does with Adam and Eve. That here's this tree, that it's this place of will you choose God or will you not? That tree does become a point of vulnerability for humanity. And God intentionally puts it there so that we would constantly choose him. And so then what would we see the role of Satan, what he does, what his will is to come along and to poke at that place of vulnerability. Is God really to be trusted here? See, but the great news is that this enemy has defeated. Jesus is our King. He's the commander of our lives. Greater is he that's at work in us than he's at work in the world. But it's still an acknowledgement that the enemy is at work in the world. Chuck Lowe says this, like a wounded and cornered animal, Satan thrashes around desperately with the aim of injuring as many of his enemy as possible before his own destruction. So the defeat of Satan does not mean the end of trouble for the church. To the contrary, it signals an escalation and intensification of opposition and persecution. But the end is in sight, and those who endure to the end shall be victorious. Even in the meantime, they become victims. So in Paul's specific case here, God strengthens Paul to endure the onslaught of the enemy. God will empower Paul to remain steadfast. God in his power and wisdom somehow exploits and uses the work of the devil to do a good work in Paul's life. But in other scenarios, followers of Jesus are encouraged to work against the work of demonic opposition in the world. Sometimes there are delays to what we're praying for because we need to persevere in prayer and labor against the ongoing forces of evil in our world. And we're reminded here that there is a reality that is beyond what our eyes can see. Let's keep on going. Sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like because we are to learn to enjoy God. Our weaknesses make us think that we are less than. See, what we want to do is we want to draw direct lines between health, prosperity, relationships, possessions, leadership, popularity, to how Jesus is currently delighting in us. But what the pages of Scripture tell us is that the person with the most can actually be the most bankrupt. Our weaknesses make us think that we are less than, but God tells us a different story. You are loved. And nothing can take that away. We equate the lack of healing with God withholding his grace. But this answer that God gives to Paul shows us that his grace is so much greater than what we realize. He is our grace. He is our joy. Pete Greig again says, in God's kingdom, happiness is not marked out primarily by popularity, fat bank accounts, or clean bills of health, but rather by proximity to the Father. Jesus is teaching us our souls can be satisfied in the driest of deserts because we have him. Psalm 63, verse 3 just simply says it this way. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. One of the things that I'm hoping for in this sermon series is just simply this, is that we would learn to delight in Jesus, in him. In him. And one of the things that I'm consistently recognizing in this practice of silence and solitude that I have in my backyard most of the days in the week is that nothing happens. Most of the time, I sit there. And I just sit there. And I'm tempted to pick up my phone to see how long I've been sitting there. And sometimes I do, and it's only been 45 seconds. And I have 9 minutes and 15 seconds more to go. I have yet to hear God actually speak in those moments of silence and solitude. Like you expect, like here's what's going to happen, is that you're going to sit there in that moment and all of a sudden the heavens are going to break open and then God's just going to speak and answer every single question that you have and solve every problem that exists in your life. And it doesn't play out that way. Here's what ends up happening. Around 8 minutes and 30 seconds in, all of a sudden I just get an awareness of his presence. And there's a moment of joy. There's a smile that comes across my face. And in about 9 minutes, 17 seconds, it fades away. But I'm learning in those moments to be patient. Because God often works at a pace that I don't expect. And I'm learning to be there in that space and to discover God's presence at work where I didn't think it was. Let's keep on going. Sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like because we discover that his way is better. Paul had a solution, didn't he? He comes to God and he says, take this thorn away from me. For Paul, that makes complete sense. To come before him. I have something that's agonizing me. I'm coming before you and saying, take it away. But what Paul concludes as he writes to us is that Jesus had a different priority. Paul wanted relief from this thorn in his flesh, and Jesus desired refining in Paul's life. Paul asked for deliverance, Jesus sought development. Paul, you see that there's a thorn in your side. That's what you see. You see a thorn in your side, but I see pride in your heart. There's something actually deeper in you than a thorn in the flesh. Paul, you are looking at surface level. I'm looking deep into the interior of your life. So Paul has to confess to the church, to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn. And I think the challenge in all of this is that God is patient and plays the long game in our lives. He just doesn't seek to do something on the surface level, but he seeks to do something deep within us. So he may at times withhold something from us that we're crying out for in prayer because there's something different that he wants to work at in our lives. Your request, Paul, is too surface level. You want to be freed from this thorn, but there's something deeper in you that needs to be pulled out. You want that thorn gone, but what I will accomplish in your life is so much more. Because by keeping that thorn there, you'll learn my strength. You'll learn to delight in my presence. You'll be a source of encouragement to others. You'll be more like Jesus, and you'll have better perspective about weakness and suffering. And that's a place of frustration and mystery, isn't it? That we would come before the Lord and say, here's what I recognize. And God would say, I see so much deeper and so much more at play than that. And sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like because he's developing us. God is refining us. God's response to Paul was that I'm going to use this place of torment for my redemptive purposes. I'm going to teach you and shape you, but it'll mean endurance and perseverance for you. I think the challenge for us is that what we must recognize is that it is a common experience, a regular experience, for followers of Christ to be led by God into places of development. St. John of the Cross describes that there's what is called the dark night of the soul. It's these places that God himself actually leads us into. That there are places of grief, of doubt, spiritual crisis, where God seems shadowy and distant. And what's wild about Scripture is that it's just honest. That there are times that it seems like God goes missing. And what we have to wrestle with is that God's people have an extremely long history of understanding the silence of God to be an aid to our faith, not an enemy to it. And it's not a question if we'll experience this, but when we'll experience this. Where God is leading us to this place of formation. And what he's doing is that he's ridding us from these really strong attachments that exist in our lives. That there are core parts of our lives that are incongruent with who God is, and it's an incredibly difficult and painful process for God to free us from those things. In the classic book, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's a boy named Eustace. What we find is that he discovers this massive treasure, and he falls asleep on this treasure. And when he wakes up, he is a dragon. And as he wakes up to this, a lion approaches him. It's Aslan. The king of Narnia comes to him and leads Eustace to the waters and tells Eustace to begin to undress. And so what Eustace does is he begins to scrape at those dragon scales, and every time that he does, he realizes it's making no effort. It's making no difference. He's not making any progress whatsoever. And then this is what Eustace tells his friends. That lion begins to put his claws to Eustace's skin. And he tells his friends this: I was afraid of his claws, I can tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now. The very first tear he made was so deep that I thought it had gone right into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I have ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was the pleasure of feeling that stuff being peeled off. Well, he peeled that beastly stuff right off. And what we discover is that to have who we have been ripped away from us is an incredibly painful process. And sometimes it's God that is actually the one leading us into that process. The mystery here is, as Tish Harrison Warren states it, suffering doesn't merely happen to us, it works in us. I'm afraid of the dark, she says, but increasingly, I'm more afraid of missing the kind of beauty and growth that can only be found there. Sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like, and sometimes God is silent and seemingly distant from us because he is developing us, because that actually is the best thing for us. Can I tell you that there are some times when I ask my 5-year-old to go into his room and to clean his room? And this is the regular response when he steps into that space. There's too much. I don't know where to start. He's overwhelmed. His 5-year-old mind is absolutely overwhelmed by the mess that he's stepping into. He falls onto the floor and cries out, I don't know where to begin. Sometimes I step into his mess and I start cleaning it up with him. And sometimes I don't answer him at all. There are some times that I just let him sit in that space. There's some times that he's just crying for dozens of minutes, crying. I don't know what to do. I need your help. Tell me where to start. And I don't answer. Because I realize in that moment that what's better for his development in life, and knowing that there are going to be more messes that he's going to be navigating, there are going to be more things in his life that he's going to have to learn to handle and carry the weight of in life, that I'm silent. I don't give him a response. And I'm going to use that task at hand as a tool of development. Two weeks ago, I made a stupid decision, and I decided I was going to work out by running stairs. I have yet to recover from it. But can you imagine in that moment, as I'm running the stairs, what my muscles would do? If they could speak, what they would be crying out? Stop. Why are you doing this to me? This makes no sense. And if I could speak to them, I would actually say this ripping and tearing that's happening in your life is actually for your good. This is for your development. And that the pain that you're feeling now is actually because I have greater things ahead for you. I want development. I want development. And as followers of Christ, this is what we realize, that when God is silent, that in these spaces it has to be a place where I recall his goodness. And I make a point to write out the areas of God's faithfulness that have been expressed to me in the past. That I make it a point to connect with others and to hear their stories about how God is doing something in their lives, so that I can get a bigger picture of God at work in the world. I make intentional choices to fast. I make intentional choices to worship. Because what I realize is that while I don't taste the flavor of God's word in my life and his work in my life, he is still sustaining me. And what's happening in these moments is that my roots are going down deeper into God's love. That's actually the work that's at play in my life. And what's happening, why do roots need to go down deeper? Well, because there is deeper water to be found, and there are storms coming in which those roots need to be down deeper into the soil. And so the typical work that happens as we come out of these times in which God leads us into the dark nights of our souls is that usually when we come out of those spaces, we're more attuned to our own brokenness and thus more gracious and patient with others in our lives, because we have to come to face with our own frailty and weaknesses. I don't have it all figured out. So when others don't have it all figured out, I'm more patient with them. There's a much deeper joy in our lives because we realize that joy doesn't come from life being perfect and without calamity to it. And we're more okay with not understanding what God is doing because he has shown himself to be faithful even in the darkest of times. The last one that I want to take us to is that sometimes our prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like because it's about Jesus. It's for the sake of Christ. My friend and hero, Ken Calvert, says it this way. The thing about calling yourself a servant is that eventually people will start treating you like one. One of the most loved and cherished titles that the early church held on to was servant, was slave. That they considered this to be a place of great honor. That their life would be used to serve the purposes of God in the lives of others. For them, Paul writes to the church that's where his joy would be made complete. That God would be using his life for the sake of others. Because to be near Jesus is to be influenced by his desire to lay down his life for the sake of others. I forget which one of these books, it was in Prayer of the Night where someone was reflecting on the fact that Jesus was terrible at PR. Because what he would do is he'd go out and tell people like that to hold on to your life was to lose it. And that we were called to take up our cross. That he was going out, what he was selling to the world is that you had to lay down your life. But then they also reflected that while he was terrible at PR, he also drank his own poison. He lived it out. Pete Greig says there's a divine alchemy at work in all faithful suffering. Because we look back and realize that it was actually our disappointments and not our plaudits that led the Lord, that the Lord has transformed to gold. In this passage, Paul tells us that it's for the sake of Christ. It's here in the torment and the calamities and the weaknesses that the power of Jesus is seen. Here is where the mysterious power of God is seen. Jesus redefines power and influence. He doesn't show us his will through forceful control of our lives, but through sacrifice and suffering. That if we want to have influence, that if we want to be a people to see things change in the world around us, it won't be by having influence the way that we would like to have influence. It isn't by us having more power in the world. It's by us laying down our lives. As Richard Foster then says it, so our question is not, why is there suffering in the world, but how do I enter into the suffering that is in the world in a way that is redemptive and healing? Because the victory of Jesus goes through suffering, not around it. So as followers of Christ, we realize that we enter into the suffering of the world. Let me wrap up our time together by reading this really long reflection by Richard Foster. It'll come up on the screen. He says this: in one sense, healing prayer is incredibly simple. Like a child asking her father for help. In another sense, it is incredibly complex, involving the entangled interplay between human and divine, between the mind and the body, between the soul and the spirit, between the demonic and the angelic. As Kenneth Swanson reminds us, we all live in a fallen world where illness, suffering, and pain are part of the fabric of existence. Sometimes we make a faulty diagnosis of the problem and pray, for example, for physical healing when the real need is emotional healing. Sometimes we neglect the natural means of health, such as diet and exercise and sleep. Sometimes we refuse to see that medicine as one of the ways that God heals. Sometimes we do not pray specifically enough or do not get down to the root of the problem. Sometimes we're not an adequate conduit for the flow of God's love and power. The faith and compassion in us not yet sufficiently developed. Sometimes there's sin in our life that hinders God's work. I could go on. For the reasons healing does not occur are labyrinthine. But whatever the reason, the sad fact is that sometimes we stand face to face with one for whom we prayed and he or she is not well. What are we to do? Well, first of all, let me tell you what we are not to do. Under no circumstance are we to tell those receiving prayer that it is their fault, that they lack the faith, or that there must be some sin in them that is hindering the prayer or any such thing. This will only redouble the burden they must carry. It has been painful enough for them to seek us out. If we must place blame somewhere, let's place it on ourselves as the prayerers. Perhaps it is our lack of faith or our sin that is hindering the flow of God's grace and mercy. Actually, the matter of blame is simply not the issue. When the disciples got into the blaming game, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus dismissed their speculations as irrelevant. The simple fact is that we are learning the prayer that heals, and there is much we do not understand. Often we must stand under the imponderable mysteries of the divine. On occasion, Jesus' disciples also failed in their attempts at healing prayer. The one thing we are to do is to show compassion. Always. The gospel writers frequently mention that Jesus was filled with compassion for people. In one story, a leper came to Jesus begging to be healed. When Jesus looked at the leper, he was moved with compassion. The Hebrew Aramaic roots of compassion are inward parts, what the Old King James Version used to call the bowels of mercy. It comes from the same source as the word womb. And so we could speak of the womb-like heart of Jesus, which brought healing mercy to the leper. Now, Jesus could have kept his distance and commanded the man to be made well, but instead, he touched him. Jesus' touch of compassion was comparable to our taking hold of a person with AIDS, stopping the bleeding with our own hands, and putting our own life in jeopardy. This is the compassion of Jesus. Would you stand with me and we enter into song together?